So my name is Maureen Babb. I'm a liaison librarian in the Sciences and Technology Library, and I'll be presenting to you on open access. The objectives of today's class are, or education session, I guess, not technically a class, and I'm just going to start a timer so I don't go over time here. So we're going to learn about the history of the open access movement. We're going to learn what open access is. We're going to learn how to find open access journals, and we're going to discuss considerations for publishing in open access journals, publishing your work open access, the benefits and the detriments. So to begin, the history of the open access movement, the concept for it existed before the term open access was formally coined. For example, Archive, which is a preprint server in the physics and math and sciences, was created in 1991. But the idea of open access as we know it was formally developed in the early 2000s. And this sort of came out of this realization that, well, we've got this internet, we've got all this access, or this ability to make things more accessible, to make things more available, because we don't have to put everything in physical journals that you have to buy, that you have to ship everywhere. So there were sort of three main statements about open access. The first one came in 2002, the Budapest Open Access Initiative. Then there was the Bethadusa Statement on Open Access Publishing and the Berlin Declaration on Open Access, both of those in 2003. And as you probably know, open access resources are becoming more and more commonplace. When they first showed up, there was a lot of discussion about whether they were or could be as good as your standard subscription-based journals. I see a hand up, but I don't see an associated question. If you want to put type the question into the chat or into the questions box, that would be great. Otherwise, I won't be able to respond to what you have to say. So feel free to put your question into the chat. Yeah, so open access is becoming more and more commonplace. As it's become more commonplace, there's less and less debate about whether or not the form of open access is valid, because of course it is, and in fact it's, in my opinion, a very good thing, and I would say in most people's opinion a very good thing. So that's sort of a brief history of the open access movement, but what is open access exactly? So open access, and historically it's focused on peer-reviewed documents, so journal articles. And the idea is to make these universally and freely accessible. Typically this is done online, putting it up on the internet, but it can be done in other ways as well, as long as it can be universally and freely accessible. And as we've seen, there are some issues, as this pandemic has shown us. Not everybody has the same level of access to the internet. So not everything is as universally and freely accessible as it might seem just because it's up on the internet. But the idea, universally and freely accessible peer-reviewed articles. The copyright owner grants permission, so that's often the author, but sometimes it's the journal, for others to use, copy, and distribute the publication as long as there's attribution. And that these are deposited in an online repository, but not just any online repository, not just your website that you've made up in one night while you were bored, but in a repository that's committed to providing access, to providing long-term archiving, and to providing interoperability. I'm sure you've all had experiences where you had something up on a website and that website has gone down and it's been lost, and or there's been some update to a program and you haven't been able to access your old files because it's changed so much. And so the idea of open access is that no, we're not only putting it up for people to see, but we're putting it up for people to see and for it to be available in the long term. So constantly updating, constantly making sure that that archivable material still exists and that it's still accessible in a form that modern computers, modern programs can read and access. So what are the benefits of open access? Well, from the point of view of accessing the research, it's freely available. There's no paywalls, which makes it easier for people who are not, say, affiliated with an institution and don't have access to subscription-based resources. The barriers to inequity of access are removed or reduced. As I mentioned earlier, this pandemic has shown us that there's different levels of access with regard to the internet itself, but it's easier to access something if it's freely available on the internet than if it costs $45 for a single article if you're not a member of a library institution. The idea is that it's available for all, and this one gets used a lot to argue for the benefits of open access in a very economic sense, which is a lot of research, especially research that's done at universities, is publicly funded. And therefore, that research should be available to the public who have funded it. And historically, that hasn't been true because it's been in these journals, been in these subscription databases. So open access is trying to change that and say, no, here's all this information. Anybody can read it. It's all good. In terms of publishing your research, so if you've got an article and you wanted to put it up there, open access increases the visibility of your work. You get more citations. It helps you comply with granting requirements. And we'll talk about a lot of this later on in the talk. It makes it easier to share. So your institution and your colleague's institution may be different. They may have different levels of access to certain subscription-based resources, or one of your colleagues or friends may not be affiliated with an institution at all. Having it open access just allows you to share it regardless of the publisher requirements. Finally, one of the concerns about open access historically has been that open access journals may not be as prestigious as some of the traditional journals that have existed for a long term. But the truth is that open access journals can be as prestigious as any traditional journal. So that's not something to worry about, and especially as more journals become open access or become hybrid, which means they're partially open access and partially traditional format. This continues to be true, and I believe that open access will continue to grow and expand, and most journals will eventually be open access going forward. So in terms of finding open access resources, and this is something for if you're finishing up a degree, or you're not sure if you're going to be at the institution, or you're not sure if you're going to have institutional access to subscription-based resources for very long, it's important to know where to find open access resources, because this allows you to have access to scholarly research going forward, despite the fact that you may no longer be affiliated with an institution. So it's good to know where to find this stuff. The first place for University of Manitoba folks is to go to the University of Manitoba Library's website, and I'll talk about each of these in more detail. Another one is the Directory of Open Access Journals. Another one is Pubmed Central and other open access repositories, because PubMed Central is an open access repository. And there are also browser extensions that can help you out. So if you go to the library's website, the link at the top will take you to a page that's got information about the library. Right in the middle, there's a search bar. And you can punch in whatever you're looking for. I've decided to do a search for Torosaurus here. And when I go into it, it'll come up with a list of resources, and most of them won't be open access. But then on the left-hand side, there's a list of filters, and you can select open access specifically. And so once you've done that, it'll limit to open access, and you can see here, this is how you know an article is open access. And so if you click on that, you should be able to access it regardless of whether or not you're still affiliated with the University of Manitoba. So very basic, we've got a decent collection of open access resources just available through our library website, but we don't have everything here, and there are other places to access open access resources. One of the biggest and most important open access resources is this, the Directory of Open Access Journals. And you can see here, you can search for journal name, or you can search for journals, and you can search for specific subjects, or you can search for articles. So if you're looking to do research on a topic, great, you can see what's coming up in there, and I'm not going to demonstrate it because it's basically a search engine. You largely know how to do this. If there is interest afterwards in the question period, I can do live demonstrations of any of these. Or you can search for journals, and this is useful if you're looking for open access journals in your field. Maybe you're considering publishing in them, or maybe you just want to see what's out there and subscribe to them. The Directory of Open Access Journals has a level of standards that's associated with it. So not just any old piece of garbage can be submitted to this. They have to meet a certain level of quality before they'll be included, which is part of what makes this one of the best open access resource sites out there. We'll talk a little bit about it further along in the webinar here today, but there are unscrupulous journals that have seeped into the open access movement, which is unfortunate. But you can certainly do your due diligence and make sure that the journals that you are looking for are quality journals, and that's what you want when you're looking for research and or when you're looking to publish in something. So there's Pubmed Central. This is different from standard PubMed, which you may be familiar with. Pubmed Central is a repository. It's been created so that people who have done publicly funded research can upload their submissions here or their articles here so that people can read them. It tends to be more medical, unsurprisingly, but there's general biology and genetics and things like that in here as well. Excuse me. So Pubmed Central is an example of a repository. And repositories are places where you can do what I described with Pubmed Central, which is archive your work. And it's often a preprint copy of your work. So that is work that comes either before you've sent it off for peer review or after it's been accepted, but not such that it's been formatted for the journal itself. So not the nicely laid out version that the journal has. Sometimes the ones that have had the corrections are called postprints, and the terminology for preprints and postprints, there's a graphic here on the side that describes them, but they'll often be used sort of semi-interchangeably, which is a little bit frustrating. But both of them are created before the final published version of the work. And so repositories, most academic institutions have a repository of their own. We have our own. Ours is called MSpace. And if you're a student or a staff member at the University of Manitoba, you can upload your work there. And we can help you with that. I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation here. There are also discipline-specific repositories. Pubmed Central is one of those. There's medRxiv, which takes medical preprints. There's also, I did that search for Torosaurus. There's also a paleo archive. There's probably something for your discipline as well. And we at the library would be happy to help you find it if you are unfamiliar with them. Yeah, preprint servers are similar, related, sort of the same thing. They're for yet unpublished work and work that has been published in a journal and allows hosting of preprints to meet open access requirements. So it allows you to host a preprint or a postprint, but again, not that final published journal article, which is typically only done with something called gold open access, which I'll talk about a little bit further. Now, one of the more seamless ways to access open access resources is with these browser extensions. There are sort of two main ones. There's Open Access button and there's Unpaywall. And Unpaywall, you can also search the site itself. But what these do is if you're interested in an article that you've looked up somewhere else, you install them on your browser, and so they're sort of running in the background, and they will scour the internet, all the sites that they know of, all the various repositories all over the world, looking for open access versions of the same paper that you're trying to access that might be behind a paywall. So this is particularly beneficial to people who are no longer affiliated with an institution, and they are sorry, I've lost my train of thought here a little bit. They're beneficial for checking things that you might not check. So many of the institutional repositories, for example, are the content in them is accessible if you do, say, a search on Google Scholar, but not all of them. And these curate and collect every open access resource that they know of, and then it'll search through all of those. So very comprehensive and very seamless because they're browser extensions. They're running in the background. You don't need to go to a special site the way you need to do if you're going to the directory of open access journals or Pubmed Central or anything like that. So in terms of evaluating open access resources, there are some things that you want to consider. What's the credibility of the journal and the author? Is the journal itself listed in the directory of open access journals, i.e. does it have a certain level of quality associated with it? Is the content that you're looking at, is it hosted in an open access repository? And if so, are you looking at a preprint that's been peer-reviewed or a post-print, or a post-print that has been peer-reviewed, or a very early preprint that hasn't been peer-reviewed and may be very different from the final version that was accepted in the journal? And these are things to be wary of. Another thing to be wary of, and I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end of the session, but there are things called predatory journals, which they make an effort to look like real journals, but they will publish basically anything for money. And you want to make sure that the journal you're looking at, the article you're looking at, isn't published in one of these, because you can't speak to the quality of the resource there, and you can't speak to whether or not it's been peer-reviewed. So open access is great, but make sure you're paying attention. Is it a preprint? And if it's a preprint, what does that mean in terms of the findings that you're pulling out of it? Does it line up with the final published version? And usually things are fairly similar, but sometimes the authors have been forced to make very major changes, and the preprint is quite different than the final published work. So, okay, so that's finding open access if you're doing research and you want to look at open access resources. But what if you've got a paper and you're thinking about publishing open access? So that's a good question. So in terms of what are the benefits, well, you get more exposure for the work. It's just available for more people to see. You can have, you get higher citations. There have been multiple studies on this that suggest that you get more citations, maybe because they're more visible if you've published open access. Your research can influence policy, and or practitioners can use your work, practitioners who may not be working at an institution that has access to the other subscription journals. So there's more influence that you can have if your work is available for people to see, and they don't have to worry about paywalls, or they don't have to be sent the articles specifically by you. The public can also access your findings, so you can get more attention that way. It helps you be compliant with grant regulations. We'll talk about that more in detail. As I mentioned, the publicly funded research is available to the public who has paid for it with their tax dollars. And researchers in developing countries can see your work. Now, this is a big thing because many of the institutions in developing countries can't afford the subscriptions, and some databases allow access freely for people in developing countries like JSTOR, but not all of them. And many of the resources, or many of the scholarly resources that are available to us here in Canada are not available to people in these other countries. And so this makes sure that, yes, they are available. They can still see them. You're not just limiting your stuff to, you know, the Western world. So those are the benefits of publishing open access. Highly recommend doing it. Granting agency compliance. So many, if not most now, granting agencies require some level of open access. If you're thinking about a publication, or a granting agency rather, and you're not sure whether or not the granting agency has open access requirements, you can go to this site called Sherpa Juliet. And what this does is it scans through the funder's open access policies, and it'll show you what it says about them. It's always worth it to double check on the funder's site themselves, because it may have changed since Sherpa Juliet was last updated, but it's a good place to start. And so in Canada, of course, the three big funders are the tri-agencies, so CIHR, SSHRC, and NSERC, so health sciences and social sciences and humanities. And for them, grant recipients are required to ensure that any peer-reviewed journal publications arising from agency-supported research are freely accessible within 12 months of publication. So you can do this in two ways. You can do it with the repositories that I've discussed. Again, for those of you at the University of Manitoba, MSpace is probably the repository that you should be considering depositing your preprints or postprints into. Or you can submit to an open access journal or a hybrid journal. Hybrid journals are journals that are partially open access and partially traditional format. And basically you can pay if you want to, you as an author get to decide whether you want to pay and then have your work be open access and available to all. And there are different rules for different agencies. So make sure you know that before you start on your grant requirements, and make sure you have a plan. Are you going to submit to an open access journal? Because if you are, you probably have a fee that's associated with that, and you'll need to think about that and plan that into your grant proposal. And if you're going the repository way, then you don't need to worry about that building in that funding in the same way. Whoops. So there are two types, well, there are more than two types. I'm going to talk about two types of open access. So there's gold open access, which is work that's published in an open access or hybrid journal. So the final version, the published version of your paper, is freely accessible. And often, not always, but often, you'll be charged an author processing charge. So you have to pay a fee in order for the work to be made open access, and that's how the journals make their money and cover their funds, or cover their fees and that sort of thing. Traditional publishing models have authors pay nothing up front, and then readers or libraries, people who subscribe to the journal or purchase individual articles, are the ones covering the fee by paying for it. Green open access is you submit to a traditional journal just like normal, no fees for you, and then you self-archive, usually a preprint or a postprint. Sometimes journals will allow you to archive the published version of a paper, but you self-archive, so you do the work of archiving your paper in one of the repositories. And there's often an embargo period for this. So, you know, my journal comes out in, or my journal article comes out in 2020, but I can't post it until 1 year later, 2021. And so, again, no charge to author. So gold open access or green open access. And make sure you consider what you're going for here, what works best for you. If you're not able, or you didn't think about building article processing charges into your grant funding application, probably Green OA is a better bet for you. So much like with checking the funder requirements, you can also check the journal requirements. And you can do this by going to Sherpa Romeo. So Sherpa Romeo lets you check the title of the journal, and it'll tell you, okay, yeah, no, this is a gold open access journal. This is fine. You can access this. Or it'll say maybe green open access. 6 months later, you can post your preprint in a repository. Again, it's better to check, like look on here to get a sense, but verify it for sure on the journal website, even though journal websites can sometimes be a little bit of a mess. But best to have a look that way. So in terms of finding open access journals to publish in, I maintain that the best way to find a journal to publish in general is to know the journals in your field, which ideally you've been researching, and you should have some sense of them, and you can take a look at it and be like, okay, well, I know this journal, and they publish things like I'm wanting to publish. You can have a look. Are they open access? Are they hybrid? Barring that, I'd start with the directory of open access journals. Take a look there. You know that the journals in there have gone through a certain level of quality screening. So you can have a better sense of something that would be good. Yeah, there are tools for certain disciplines, like there's the cofactor journal selector that I've provided a link to here. That's typically for medicines and some sciences. And you can specify, like, I'm only looking for open access, or I'm looking for hybrid, or things like that. I don't find it to be overly useful, but it might be more beneficial in your field. And again, beware of predatory journals. If you're getting email solicitations saying, we know of your illustrious work, we're hoping that you'll publish in our journal because we love we think you're preeminent in your field, that's probably a garbage email, and you should delete it immediately, and you should not publish in that journal. And in terms of watching out for that sort of thing, you can go to the site Think, Check, Submit, which can act as a guide for helping you decide which journals are worth publishing in and which ones are not worth publishing in, and which ones are, in fact, actively predatory. Yes. But again, you want to do your due diligence. You don't want to submit to just any old journal because your work is valuable and you should publish it in a valuable journal or a quality journal. So, publishing fees. As I said, traditional publishers don't charge the authors. They charge subscription fees to readers and to libraries in order to collect the funds that they need to run their operation. For open access publishers, they still need to make money somewhere, but because all their resources are open, nobody's paying for a subscription fee. So they do this by charging the authors. So at the front end instead of at the back end. And these can be quite pricey. Some of them can be relatively cheap, like a few $100. But Nature, for example, recently said, okay, we're going hybrid. Some of our articles will be open access. All you have to do is pay us $11,390 US. So when I say build it into your grant applications, I do mean it. I don't have 11,000 spare dollars running around or lying around. I suspect most of you don't either. And to be fair, this is a very, very expensive fee, and when it was announced, people made a lot of fun of it because of how over the top it is. Your average article processing charge is in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, so still a decent chunk of change, but not quite as frightening as that fee there. There are also open access journals with no subscription fees, and they also don't charge the article processing charges. And these are referred to as platinum open access, and they're often associated with a scholarly society. So they're getting the money to run the journal with the dues that they accrue from their membership. And so this is more common in some fields than others. Some fields have absolutely none of these platinum open access journals. Librarianship, my field, has quite a few of them, which isn't really a surprise because librarians tend to be fairly committed to open access and to improving the open access horizons for the future. So you've got these publishing fees, and you need help with them. So the library, we have some support for open access, for helping you deal with article processing charges. We used to have a fund that would pay for them. We no longer have that fund available, unfortunately. I think it stopped in 2015. But we do have discounts available for a number of different publishers. And if you go to the website that I've linked there, you can see a list. And then we'll also help you if necessary. If your publisher, if your journal isn't on that list, we can take a look through their website and see, or even contact them and see if they'll maybe waive the fees or reduce the fees based on the fact that you don't have any money, which does happen, not always, but it's always worth it to ask whether the fees can be reduced or removed entirely. And so our discounts, they don't show on this screenshot just because it's cut off, but they range from like 10% to 20 or 25%. So not the whole thing, but something. We also have other open access resources. As I've mentioned, we have MSpace, which the first time you're navigating it, and particularly the first time you're trying to submit something to it, it can be a little bit overwhelming, or maybe not overwhelming, just unclear. And so we can work with you to help you submit your preprints and your postprints to that repository. Again, there's the OA fee discounts, and we can help you deal with the requirements of the tri-agency or really any other granting agencies. And we're happy to meet with you to chat one-on-one about open access and open access requirements. So far, I've been talking about open access as it relates to published work, peer-reviewed journal articles. And that's where most of the focus on open access has been to date, but there's an increasing movement towards open data. So that is making sure that the data that you collect in the course of your research is available so that other people can consult it, so that other people can recreate or verify the findings of your study. And this is probably going to become even more prevalent in the future. It's probably going to be something that is more and more required by funding agencies. So it's good for you to be aware of this now so you can start thinking about it. And there are these things that the library can help you with called data management plans, or DMT. And these are a document that outline how you're going to manage the data all the way from collection to storage and long-term preservation. And you should build a data management plan before you begin your research so that you're not scrambling to figure out how to make your data available at the last minute, or how to, anonymize it, or whatever you need to do. So we can help you with this. The website that I've put there has a lot of information about it. Like MSpace, we have something called Data Deposit, which if you need to post your data somewhere, you can post it there. And we've got a data management guide, and we can work with you for data management plans, or you can take a look at the DMP assistant there, or the quick tips. So that is open data, something to keep your eye out for the future, or even to start considering now so that you're ahead of the curve, so that when it does become standard in grant agency requirements, you already know what you're doing and aren't scrambling. And so I've talked a few times about predatory journals through the course of this presentation. And on March 2nd, I'm going to be giving a whole session on predatory journals, if that's something that you're concerned about or would like to hear more about. But basically, the long and the short of it is that the model for open access that exists right now, the author processing charge that they take at the beginning from the authors, is open for easy exploitation. I could get bored one night, make a website that looks like a formal journal, and then spam a whole bunch of researchers at, 10, 20, 100 universities, and say like, hey, I'd love if you published in this, pay me $200. And most people would probably realize that it was a scam, but some people would be like, that sounds great. I'd love to publish in your journal. Here's $200. Here's my article. And this is a problem for a variety of reasons, because it's not a real journal. I'm not committed to, long-term preservation the way that true open access journals are. I'm not committed to, say, peer review. I'm just in it to make a quick buck. So not only are you publishing in a journal that isn't good quality, but there's potential for the work you've done, the research you've done, to be lost, because if you've published with a fake journal or a predatory journal, then you often can't publish with a legitimate journal because it's already been published. But if that journal disappears, then your work is gone with it. And so there was recently a consensus definition for predatory journals created. It's published in Nature. And the definition that they came up with is predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. And that means that they send you these overly flattering emails praising you for your work and telling you how great they think you'd be if you submitted to their journal. And so this is something to watch out for. Now, most open access journals are absolutely on the level. And, the ones that you'll find in the directory of open access journals are generally pretty good. The ones that you know by name that actually matter to your field, they're going to be pretty good. But yeah, if you want to hear more about more about predatory journals, join me on March 2nd. And so that's it. Thank you for attending. Hopefully I'll see some of you on March 2nd. Bye.